but I'd be chatting with someone at work on a Monday. And they say, "Oh, what'd you do this weekend?" And so I went diving, did some wreck diving off of Jersey, and the person would go, "Oh, really? What kind of shipwreck?" I'd say, "Oh, it was, the Tolton or the Gulf Trade. It was a ship that was torpedoed by a U-boat in World War II." And inevitably, almost every time, invariably I get the response of, like, "What? U-boats off the Jersey shore?" And I had this same conversation again with many different people over, "Oh, what do you like to do?" "I like diving." "Oh, what kind of wrecks are out there?" "Well, there's these World War II." What? So that was really what put the idea in my head that really kind of drove it home to me that there's the story here, obviously, but there's a story that people don't know about and that I think people would be interested in if I could tell it the right way.
All right. Well, welcome, K.A. Nelson, to the podcast. How's it going?
Hey, Andrew, thanks for having me.
All right. Well, I know that you've written an awesome book about all the German U-boats and everything that all the action that was happening on the Jersey Shore, and you're an expert in this field, and you got a lot of experience. So I really wanted to bring you on. And all right, well then let's get to it. So just a little intro for our guests. K.A. Nelson, he's an author. Killing Shore, the true story of Hitler's U-boats off the Jersey coast. He's a Marine Corps veteran, currently living in Philadelphia. And he's an experienced wreck diver with an extensive number of dives off the coast of New York, New Jersey, California, and North Carolina. So, all right, well, let's get into it. So I guess if you want to maybe kind of walk us through. So I guess, what does it start? Really around what, World War I, World War II, and kind of the kind of build up and lead up with all the technology and everything for the war. Do you want to kind of walk us through the whole thing and how they ended up coming to be right off the Jersey coast? So
Sure. So I'll do my best to make it as concise as possible. So part of the reason that Killing Shore is as long as it is, I mean, you have a copy of the book. It's not a short read. Is that I wanted the reader to be able to understand and appreciate the events of part two, which is what I call the main story. That's really the Jersey centric story. And I felt in order to do that, I had to spend at least a little bit of time talking about World War I and kind of the dawn of submarines as a warfighting platform. So for that reason, chapter 2 of part 1, so part 1's 4 chapters, and chapter 2 is really all about World War I and the rise of the U-boat, if you will. And at that time, when World War I exploded in 1914, submarines were not, they were new technology, but they'd already been a mainstay of all the major powers, naval fleets for 10 to 15 years at that point. So they were newer technology, but it wasn't totally untested. It was untested in combat, but at the same time, the submarine was new enough that all the powers of that era, nobody quite knew exactly what role they would fill. So they had this tool. It was already operational. The Germans, as I described, actually arrived last to the game. They were the last of the major fleets to get submarines. They didn't have any until 1906. But when the war begins in 1914, it's pretty apparent that submarines will play some sort of role, but it's not really recognized how. And they are used for at the war's outset. They're used in sort of a conventional manner, as they're hunting warships. They're fighting primarily from submerged positions, from under the surface. And it wasn't until the Germans realized what a squeeze they were under with regards to the British fleet having the the entirety of the German Empire under a naval blockade, that they realized that they also had the Germans realized that they themselves had quite a potent weapon to strike back at Britain in the same way, to make Britain feel the same pain that the British were inflicting on the Germans, namely to target merchant shipping that's bringing anything in or out of the British Isles. So this is everything from troops, although that was less of a factor earlier in the war, raw materials, food, finished war material arriving from places like the United States. They realized that Britain, being an island, is obviously heavily dependent on imports coming by sea. So that was the U-boats' role in World War One, was attempting to cut Britain off by sea, and it actually almost worked. In fact, the Germans came closer to winning the war with the U-boats in 1917 than they ever would in World War II. And so that's kind of a whole story unto itself. And I didn't use chapter two to necessarily, or my goal with chapter two was to explain kind of the dawn of this technology and how it was first used, because I felt that was important to understanding how it was used in the next war.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, because they ended up, I mean, like, it's interesting because, like you said, they started off actually kind of being more used under the water, where in World War II, they ended up kind of, a lot of it was kind of on the surface, but stealthily at night and stuff like that. So it's kind of interesting. You're saying so that kind of had a bit of a different transition, you would think?
So they were primarily operating on the surface in both world wars, and that was really due to the limitations of the technology at the time. So in both world wars, a submarine, any submarine, whether it be a German submarine, which we happen to refer to as U-boats, or any of the other submarines from the other major fleets, they're really limited in what they can do underwater. Now, obviously, what makes a submarine unique is the fact that it can fight from underwater. But in that era, before nuclear power, submarines were limited in their speed and their range when they were underwater, not to mention their visibility. So in both world wars, a submarine, if it's fully submerged, which is obviously where it's the most stealthy, it can only operate that way for, depends on the speed, but their top speed submerged in World War II was about 6 to 7 knots. And even at that top speed, you get an hour of submerged movement. The
Now,
other challenge is that when you're submerged, the only person that has any situational awareness at all is the commandant, the commander, and that's what he can see out of the periscope. And if you're on the surface, you can have 4, 5, 6, 7 sets of eyes looking at the horizon. So, um, really, in both world wars, they're operating primarily on the surface. The reason that we saw in kind of in late 1914, early 1915, there were a few British warships that were sunk by U-boats operating submerged. At that phase, they were still trying to figure out how are we going to make use of this tool, and they started by taking pot shots and getting a few British cruisers. And that was a rather rude awakening for the British, but still, that's not necessarily decisive. But once the U-boats start being used primarily to go after merchant ships, which started in 1915, that's when the game kind of changes a little bit. And I've said this in other conversations I've had and speaking events I've done, that the submarines of either era, either world war, they would oftentimes attack naval vessels, battleships, cruisers, destroyers when the opportunity presented itself. Oftentimes they would tiptoe quietly away because it's a dangerous bet. So it's not that they ever stopped attacking naval vessels. It's that early on in the First World War, the Germans realized that they could really get the most mileage out of their boats by targeting merchant shipping. So that is the primary mission that U-boats carried out in both world wars. And not only U-boats, there's a whole other story to be told about in the Pacific theater of World War II. It was US Navy submarines that succeeded in doing to Japan what Germany failed to do to Britain twice, which is to completely cut off an island country. The US Navy, and particularly its submarines, by the end of World War II, had Japan completely cut off and isolated, using some of the same tactics that the Germans did. But even the US submarines were beholden to the same limitations about operating submerged. So these US wolf packs that were so devastating in the Pacific from 1943 onward, they were operating by very similar tactics, namely preferring to attack on the surface at night whenever possible.
Gotcha. And now one of the things just I wanted to make sure was that so when you were talking about how long they could spend underwater, for instance, right?
Mhm.
Um, some of those limitations, obviously, you were saying that the speed was a limitation, but a big part of it was it also was it that they were like the amount that the batteries could last, right? And then
Mhm.
stuff like that. So obviously, the faster you go, you're going to be using up more of your battery. But was it just the battery that was the, a length of time was the restriction, or was it also like a buildup of CO2, or like what were some of the things that would kind of limit the amount of time, and
Mhm.
how long could they realistically spend underwater?
So the battery really is the operative limiting factor with regard to how long they can stay under, because obviously this whatever speed that the boat is moving at submerged, that's going to dictate how long the battery lasts. So that's why I used the example of moving at top speed in the Second World War. A U-boat has about an hour, assuming that it had a fully charged battery when it died, when it submerged. Your question about the role that CO2 buildup played. So that would only really start to become a factor if a boat was sitting motionless on the bottom for a prolonged period of time. So if it was moving, assuming it's still under battery power, there's not going to be enough time for CO2 buildup to really become a major hazard. Now, if a boat is sitting on the bottom past about, I don't know when it would kick in, but after 24 hours, you're starting to really enter danger zone for the hazardous CO2 buildup. But then again, it was very rare for any submarine of either war to spend that long sitting on the bottom, unless it was disabled or something of that nature. So where CO2 would be a buildup is on those rare instances you had a submarine on the bottom for a prolonged period of time. I think after about 48 hours, the crew's going to be pretty much incapacitated. Of course, that also depends on how much CO2 they're exhaling. But the short answer is that usually that there wasn't enough time for that to become a major factor. You're really limited by the battery capacity that you have.
Gotcha. Okay, because I guess if I think I remember correctly, was when the U-550 was kind of at the bottom, while it was going through its thing, it was kinda stuck in the mud, right? And then I
Mhm.
think it was kind of sitting under the entire, destroyer fleet,
Yeah.
and and, one of the things that went off in my head was I was just like, "Why don't they just, like, just be patient? Just kinda sit here, chill, don't make any noise," like, they were kinda protected by the halocline. It seemed to me that, like, if they coulda just sat there and chilled for 24 hours, that fleet would not have just been just sitting above them, and they would have been fine, but they decided to make a dash for it, and they lost the protection of, the halocline and stuff like that. So, um, yeah, like, do you have any ideas to, like, why they didn't in that, or like, what's your thoughts on what happened with that one?
In that situation with the U-550, when it's underneath the Pan Pennsylvania and her destroyer escorting force, they really would have been better off for surviving those circumstances. Yeah, at the risk of Monday morning quarterbacking, if you will. Yeah, they would have been
Yeah.
better off just remaining motionless, especially considering there was that thermocline that was blocking the sonar. They weren't down there for anywhere near long enough for CO2 to really be a problem.
Okay,
Again,
gotcha.
assuming they're not all like doing push-ups inside the boat or something.
No
Um,
calisthenics at that time.
yeah. So they really should have stayed put. Um, I can't really speak too much as to what Captain Lieutenant Hainer, the commander, was thinking. But his instinct, which was to get out of Dodge, especially once he thought most of the destroyer escorts were gone. It wasn't like a stupid decision or anything, but yeah, all things considered, they would have been better off staying put. But in the grand scheme of things, their decision resulted in at least some of them surviving. Whereas if we're gonna look at these things through hindsight, if they had escaped that, then they probably, in all likelihood, all would have died at a few days after that, under one set of circumstances or another. But yeah, you're right. Laying on the bottom would have offered them the most security, but I think his overriding urge was to just get out of there as soon as possible.
Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean that's kind of like everything. You can't Monday morning quarterback, but it's just one of those where you got to think like, man, just be a little patient and come up in darkness, and you might have a decent chance. But yeah, like
Yeah.
you said, I think this was towards the end of the war, right? And so they were at that point they were almost like suicidal missions to try to just get as much as they could.
Hmm.
So, yeah, I guess going back to like, so these really were kind of pioneered a little bit before World War One, and then they were kind of really coming into their age. And like you were kind of mentioned, so the big thing was, I mean, Britain's an island nation, and so given that they're an island nation, I mean, it's pretty obvious is that if you can surround them entirely, or you can cut off the way that they can get any kind of, because Britain, I think they were importing a substantial amount of their stuff. I mean, even from food, they were not a self-sustaining nation.
No.
And a big part of it was that they needed oil, and you need oil to fly planes, you need oil to run everything. And so, yeah, that was Germany's was main that was for both wars, really, was kind of their big thing. And those U-boats, um, I mean, they really could have would have won the war for them.
Yeah, and I'm not a fan of counterfactuals, but in this instance, the if I had to imagine one set of scenario or one set of circumstances in World War II that would have potentially seriously changed the at least the trajectory of the war, my answer would be if Admiral Karl Dönitz, who was the commander of the U-boat force, if he had had more U-boats at the start of the war in 1939, because what his plan was if the next war starts, and this is him thinking in the 1920s and 30s, he wanted to start the war with a fleet of 300 ocean-going U-boats.
Yeah.
As it happened, he started the war with less than 50. I think all operational U-boats was less than 50, and I think ocean going in September 1939, meaning ones that could operate in the Atlantic, I want to say he had 26 or 27. So really not even a fraction of what he needed. So I'm not a fan of alternate history what ifs because it's just too easy to go off the stupid cliff. But I will say that if I were to imagine a timeline that is as close to ours as possible, where not necessarily the outcome, but the trajectory of World War II goes much differently, it would be Durnett starts the war with, say, half that number, say 150 Type 7 and Type 9 U boats. You would have seen World War II go longer, and you would have seen the first few years probably go quite a bit differently if he had started with as powerful a force as he wanted. But fortunately, that didn't happen.
Yeah, I mean, and I mean, there's 100 ways to Monday morning quarterback World War II. I mean, if
Which
Hitler
is
doesn't
why I
go,
think I avoid counterfactuals. But
yeah, yeah. I mean, I mean, I think for a lot of people like that know that, for instance, like Operation Barbarossa and them going after Russia, creating a two front war, and I mean, there's a bunch of ways that in hindsight you could look back and say they fumbled the ball a few times, but yeah, so it's definitely. But I mean, they played a massive role, and they kind of, like you said, I mean, they were a little slow to build them up, and had they done that, that could have basically, That could have been a big thing. Um, so okay, so they play a big role in World War One, and then they play a huge role in World War Two. Now, kind of, I guess, bring us into them really on along the U.S. coast. And now, I guess, were they just predominantly on the East Coast, or were they in were did the U-boats kind of go to other parts?
So they were operating along the East Coast for about 6 months. And right about the time that that winds down, they transition to the Gulf of Mexico. So we had about another 3 months there. The reason that they were deployed to the East Coast to begin with was Admiral Dönitz, again, always thinking ahead. He had requested in the interwar years, or I should say, during the first couple years of World War II, when the war had begun, but the United States was not involved yet. Dönitz had requested of his chain of command, hey, if the United States is going to enter the war, right? If we're going to pull them in or we're going to declare war on them, I would like a little bit of heads up on that because I want to have my U-boats off the East Coast ready to pounce as soon as war is declared. Well, the Pearl Harbor attack takes everyone by surprise, including the Germans. They were not forewarned in advance. And 2 days after the Pearl Harbor attack, the US and Germany are formally at war. So Dönitz in December of 1941, he's scrambling to try to get some of his forces there as quickly as possible. His ideal was to have them waiting and then all go into action at the same time. So he scrambles in December to put together all the available boats. At the time, the thinking was that only the Type 9 U boats, which are the larger ones, would have enough fuel to make the trip worthwhile. So in December 1941, he dispatches 5 Type 9 U boats to the East Coast, really from New York down to North Carolina. And at the same time, he also dispatches a larger force of Type 7s to the Canadian Maritimes. And so those two operations go on concurrently. The 5 U-boats sent to the East Coast, that was the what was called Operation Drumbeat by the Germans, Paukenschlag. Those 5 boats were on their way back to their ports by the halfway through January. They got in, they used up all their torpedoes and headed back. But by the time they were headed back, there was already several more Type 9s en route to replace them. And that's essentially the flow of this campaign for that 6 month period. There's U-boats coming and going to and from the East Coast continually. Sort of as soon as a boat is ready, it's sent out. So they're coming and going continuously rather than in waves. But something else that was learned during that December-January period from the Type 7s that went to Canada is that Dönitz's staff realized, hey, these Type 7s, the medium boats, even though they have less fuel, they're much more fuel efficient than we had thought. Right, the fuel calculations that we had written out ended up being a little bit conservative because they were doing their fuel calculations assuming that a U-boat was hunting wolf pack. So it's surfacing, it's sprinting a lot, but they realized if they're cruising at slow to medium speed over to their target area, even the Type 7 has enough fuel to operate for up to a couple weeks along the East Coast. So after Paukenschlag, after the first 5 U-boats, they start setting the Type 7s as well. So from January till the East Coast campaign winds down in June, we see Type 7s and Type 9s operating off the coast. The one that you and I have dived off North Carolina, U-352, that's a Type 7. That's one of the medium boats. But so to back to the gist of your question, so we really get 6 months of the U-boat campaign along the East Coast, and like I said, in June, really in May, there's a little bit of overlap. So in May, as the East Coast campaign is starting to wind down, Dönitz starts sending his Type 9s, because for that distance, you do need a Type 9, start sending his Type 9s to the Gulf of Mexico. And they get sort of like the first 3 months on the East Coast were really bloody. January, February, March were really, really bad in terms of shipping losses. The first month, 4 to 6 weeks in the Gulf of Mexico is also really bad. In fact, um, May 1942 in the Gulf Sea frontier, which was the U.S. Navy command that had jurisdiction, May in Gulf Sea frontier was worse than any single month in Eastern Sea frontier. So May is a slaughter in the Gulf, and then June is bad as well, and then it starts to wind down again. So by September, you've got U.S. waters are pretty much clear again, and the whole U-boat war moves into its next phase. So really, you've got 6 months on the East Coast, and then 2 to 3 in the Gulf of Mexico.
Was that
All of
kind
this
of
being in 1942.
okay? And was that what they kind of referred to? And I know there's the first happy days and the second happy days.
That all of that was part of the second happy time.
Okay, that was over the second happy time.
Yes.
And now over that time, I mean, one, are they predominantly where are most of the sinkings occurring? Are they up by North Carolina? Are they up by New Jersey, New York? Are they down? Where are they happening? Yeah. So where's the main location?
So they're occurring all over the East Coast waters and Gulf Sea frontier waters, but a few areas do have higher concentrations of losses. The single the area with the most U-boat activity that sees the most sinkings is, as you might probably be able to guess, is the waters off North Carolina, specifically between Cape Hatteras and Cape Lookout. By If you look at the wartime totals, the waters off North Carolina end up accounting for about 55% of all of the ships. That was one of the statistics that I figured out through the course of my research. So about half, a little over half of all of the sinkings in U.S. waters are going to occur off North Carolina. You've got obviously
Why
some
is
off New
that?
Jersey. I want to say there was call it 15 to 20 off New Jersey. Now, again, once we get out to sea, there's no state borders that denote these things easily. So I had to kind of invent my own rules of what I consider to be a New Jersey sinking versus a North Carolina sinking, etc. But you've got a fair amount off New Jersey, um, far fewer off New York than you would think, and New England as well.
That's where
Um,
I was gonna go with it, is just the fact that,
yeah,
like, you would typically think, like, that, alright, you've got New York City, uh, you know, huge amount of shipping is coming out of Bayonne in New Jersey, and then I'm figuring that the main area would be, like, North Fork, down in, down by Virginia and stuff like that, which is gonna be, it's our biggest, shipbuilding area and stuff like that, so I would think that that would make sense to me, that that's where the most of the ships are coming out of, and they're probably going to want to be sitting there waiting as they're, in their most vulnerable state, probably. You know what I mean?
yeah, you would think. And I've looked at maps, and I have actually graphed or mapped out using the coordinates where a lot of these things are. So essentially, off New England and New York City, you see fewer sinkings than you would think, and most of the New York ones were from the first five U-boats, especially U-123. And then as once you get south of New York, so you got 15 to 20 off New Jersey, and then south of that off Delmarva and off Maryland's Atlantic coast, you start to see even more. And then it all kind of peaks down off North Carolina. There's very few off South Carolina and Georgia, but then there was quite a few off of Florida as well. So Florida is kind of another big pocket of sinking. So you've got what I would call kind of a medium number of them off New Jersey. You got this huge amount off North Carolina. Then you see very few, and then you've got quite a few more off Florida. In fact, there's already been, as you know, at least a couple of books that have been written about the North Carolina experience of these ships being sunk. I've now kind of contributed a New Jersey one, and I'm just waiting for someone to do a Florida one because you have plenty of incidents down there as well. But that should give you kind of a general idea, for lack of a map to show you. You see them ac- across the East Coast. but you do see the kind of the hot spots. Call it North Carolina, Florida, New Jersey, in that order,
And
broadly
now,
speaking.
okay, and so now also, I mean, just to give some people that maybe don't know the logistics, I would imagine that. So, for instance, the reason why those ships are being targeted there in particular is the um, like most of our oil and energy is coming out of Texas. Texas was like the big producer back then, right? And so, which it's become now, but it went through a period where it wasn't. But back then, it was the big oil producer, and so you're getting a lot of shipments of industrial production and oil that's coming from the Gulf, making its way up the coast. And like we said, it's either stopping at different ports or it's just kind of making its way along the coast before heading out. Right? Is that kind of
That's a big part of it. So let's look at it in terms of two, we'll call them like two commodity domains, right? So we've got oil and all things related to oil. So whether it be crude oil, diesel, bunker C, but we've got petroleum products as one big category. And then the other category, we can call it everything else. So everything from manganese to wheat to one of the ships that I wrote about had all sorts of random items on it, like clocks, like alarm clocks. That was part of the cargo, coffee.
yeah,
So if you imagine the geography of the Western Hemisphere of North and South America, there's oil from Texas. That's a big part of it. There's also oil from the Caribbean and from Venezuela. Remember, back then the Caribbean was one of the world's biggest oil regions. It's not kind of as much today because other oil regions on the globe have kind of surpassed it. But back then, the Caribbean was one of the global hubs of crude oil extraction. So you have everything, all the oil that's coming from the Gulf of Mexico along the U.S. Gulf Coast. You've got oil coming from the Caribbean and South America, and then you've got everything else that's coming from South America, which is a lot of commodities and raw material exports. Again, everything from the tin, manganese, kind of some of these hard inputs to U.S. manufacturing, and then everything else, food, some textiles, also everything that was coming from South Africa came through the Caribbean. So logistically, South Africa is sort of part of the Western Hemisphere for World War II purposes because all of that had to get shipped to Trinidad in the Caribbean and then north from there. So essentially, anything that is coming to an East Coast port, so anything that's going to Kearney, New Jersey, or New York City, or Boston, or Baltimore, which were major industrial hubs back then, if it's coming from the Western Hemisphere, that means it has to come up the East Coast. There's no other way to get it there. For oil, we didn't have the pipelines to do it. We couldn't move it by rail or truck. It has to come by ship. So essentially, the Germans were able to look at a map and see, the Americans, and they understood the enormous manufacturing capacity that we had, but they were also able to see, look, all of or a large proportion of the inputs for that manufacturing, the oil, the bauxite, the tin, et cetera, that all has to come up the East Coast. So the reason that, and I might be beating you to a future question on this, but the reason that North Carolina was this enormous epicenter of U-boat activities, that anything being transported north from, whether it's from South America or even from somewhere like Texas, it has got to pass Cape Hatteras. And due to other factors, all of the northbound traffic and southbound traffic gets canalized through a shipping lane that ends up being about 10 miles wide and called about 100 miles long. So in military terms, that's what's called a canalizing feature. Like that's where you set up your ambush for when the bad guys come through. And
yeah.
the
It's
Germans
definitely a
simply
choke
read
point.
the map and did the same thing to us. So this is one of the interesting ways that geography plays a major role in world events. It's one of the reasons I have such an interest in geography is um, by looking at the map of the Western Hemisphere in North and South America, and just a little explanation like that can make it clear to someone, wow, the United States had a big liability in terms of this choke point. And of course, they sunk them in other places other than North Carolina, but most of these, or a large number of these ships that were sunk off New Jersey, were ones that were coming north and had made it safely past Cape Hatteras, what they called Torpedo Junction, which was between Hatteras and Lookout. But ships like the Gulf Trade, which is Chapter 9, the Tolton, which is Chapter 10, these were ships that had made it through that gauntlet, but then got sunk when they were off New Jersey.
Yeah, and I think touching on a few things is, I mean, one, for anybody who knows, most agricultures, obviously you have a lot of agriculture coming out of Brazil and stuff like that, but you also, the breadbasket for the Western Hemisphere is really coming out of the Midwest, and a lot of that Midwest stuff flows down the Mississippi, and so if it's coming out of the Mississippi, again, come into the Gulf, and then you've still got to make your way around to the East Coast, and so, and like you had kind of mentioned, there wasn't a pipeline that was running, which we now have today. But back then there wasn't a pipeline, and so all of that stuff really had to kind of come around the coast. And yeah, I mean, it's kind of interesting, which we'll get into in a little bit, is that when we go out diving off of North Carolina, you know, Leroy is always in his boat. He knows exactly where to go, but it's so funny because he points out to us a lot of times. He's like, "Yeah, I mean, 50 feet over to the right and 50 feet over to the left is like a sandbar. There's just it's right around North Carolina. There's just tons of sandbars. It's just not open ocean, and
Mhm.
like you said, there's really because of all that, there's really a choke point and a funnel. And yeah, I mean, if you know and understand the topography and the geography and stuff like that of the area, then which they did, which is pretty impressive. And but then yeah, it makes it easy pickings, and they really it's kind of I don't think the average person knows why there's so many. Because I mean, every time we talk to people about scuba diving, and we tell them about how North Carolina might have some of the best scuba diving in the world, and
Oh, easily
they,
it does, yeah.
oh, and they I mean they look at us like we have 15 heads, and yeah, I mean once you understand the history and of all this, I think then people really get to understand. Oh wow, um, between the Gulf Stream, between these choke points, between the history with the U-boats and everything, man, it makes North Carolina, just an absolutely special place.
Yeah,
So,
doesn't hurt that it's like 80 degrees and 80 feet of viz most days or more.
yeah, no, I mean, it's incredible. I mean, up in and also for people, which we'll get into, I mean, diving up in New Jersey on, the water is very cold, dark, and deep, and very limited visibility. Where here off North Carolina, because of the Gulf Stream, I mean, you got this amazing visibility, and these reefs, these wrecks really turn them into amazing artificial reefs, and yeah, so it just makes them really special places. So, yeah, one other thing I really wanted to touch on with regards to World War One and some of that is so in what was it around 1915, I guess, you have the Lusitania, and it's this ocean going vessel, and it's making its way from New York area, right, if I'm not mistaken, and it's
It
going
was
out to
on its
London.
way from, yeah, New York to Britain.
Okay. And so what is what's the story with the Lusitania? What's the deal? It was sunk. And is there some is there a fault? I mean, I think there's rumors about it, but I also think there's also some evidence that says that it wasn't a false flag. But what's the story behind the Lusitania, and why is it such an talked about thing?
So, and as Andrew mentioned, kids listening home, this is we're rewinding back to World War One for this one. So the Lusitania was a large passenger ship. Remember, back in these days, there was no commercial air travel, so the only way to cross the Atlantic, whether you were emigrating or just going on vacation, is you would have to travel on one of these large passenger liners. That's what the Titanic was made to do, to service those routes. So the Lusitania, which was of a similar vintage to the Titanic, was one of these. It was one of the largest and best known passenger ships in the world at that time, and the Lusitania was on her way in 1915. I want to say it was April of 1915. I could be wrong on that, but she's on her way from New York City to Great Britain on a regular, running a regular route with. I'm not sure how many total people were on board, maybe about 2,000. And she was off the coast of Ireland when she was hit by a single torpedo from a U-boat and sunk pretty quickly. And the death toll was very high. And among those killed, which were all civilians, there were also 126 Americans that were killed. So this became a big scandal in the United States as well. Remember, at this point in the war, the United States was still neutral. The U.S. did not enter the war until the spring of 1917. So this is 2 years before that. So 126 Americans are killed, and it's not only a big deal in the United States, it's a big deal internationally. And the U.S. as a neutral country at that time had been continually, we'll say, admonishing or scolding the Germans, because even though the German policy was not to target ships that were, their policy was not to sink ocean liners that are full of passengers. Like this wasn't necessarily a normal type of attack. And I don't recall the specifics. I'm not necessarily a Lusitania expert, but the Lusitania gets hit, sinks quickly. Among the large loss of life is 126 Americans. So this was something that the Germans were concerned about, because the Germans obviously did not want the United States to enter the war on the Allied side. In fact, the threat of the U.S. entering the war became the single biggest factor driving the German U-boat, the entire strategy, because they want to do as much damage to the British as they can without provoking the Americans. They want to keep them neutral. So the Germans were kind of paranoid, and that's part of the reason that we see what's called the unrestricted U-boat campaign in World War One. The Germans keep pausing it. They paused it several times because they thought they might be close to getting the Americans sufficiently pissed off. So the Lusitania was again seen by the Germans as, oh shit, I hope we didn't finally push the Americans over the edge. But there was a lot of debate about, both then and now, about the circumstances of the ship. So one of the things that the Germans said after the sinking, to try to cover their own ass publicity wise, is they said that, well, the ship had been carrying war materiel, which the Allies claimed it had not been. It came out later, and I think it might have been only in modern times that this came to light. But it turns out that the Lusitania actually did have some war
Yeah,
material in its
I mean,
cargo hold.
it did have
The
munitions on
Germans
it.
didn't necessarily, I don't think they necessarily knew that at the time, but it was hit, sunk, significant American loss of life, although at the time, the isolationist opinion in the U.S. was so strong that even the Lusitania did not seriously risk pulling the U.S. into the war. That wouldn't happen for another 2 years. So, but to your question, the Lusitania has always been kind of controversial for some of the reasons discussed. I don't think there's any serious reason to think that there was any funny business going on. Occam's razor here, as in so many other instances, really says that it more or less it did happen as described. It was just a matter of I don't remember what the German commandant, the U-boat commander, I don't remember what his exact justification was offhand. Either in his logbook or later on, but it was certainly something the Germans wish hadn't happened, because, as I said, they were paranoid about not pulling the U.S. into the war.
Yeah, and I think so. From my understanding, just for people who do kind of dabble with the conspiracy end, is that I think the one argument of it was that the U.S. Potentially knew that you know, by putting munitions on an ocean-going passenger ship was,
which was
um
not necessarily uncommon, by the way.
it wasn't uncommon, but I think it was kind of one of those gray areas, right? It was like one of those where the public doesn't think it's occurring, but everybody behind the scenes knows it's occurring kind of thing. And it just takes one miss kind of step thing. And I think the question from the conspiracy end is, did the United States government intentionally put munitions on that ocean going passenger liner? And did it put them right in the area that would have set them up for it? And then obviously, I think you had even noted, though, I think you had mentioned in your book how even the commander of the commandant of the U-boat had kind of attested that there was no real like am I correct? There was no real conspiracy on that, right?
Yeah, the remember to your earlier statement about the possibility that the ship was deliberately. I mean, all of the waters around Britain at that time were the Germans formally declared it a war zone. So it was understood that those waters were dangerous, and but there was no way to really avoid it for transatlantic travel. I think it also bears mention that the United States, the Wilson administration, adamantly did not want to get involved in the war. So they're not looking for reasons for their policy to kind of be pulled the other way. So as I said, Occam's razor, when in doubt, the most likely explanation is probably the correct one, absent some sort of compelling evidence. And if you look at all the factors here, it just seems quite self-evident to me that it is more or less the major pieces played out as they've been described. But it's relevant to mention because the Germans in both well, not just the Germans, but in both world wars, the Germans had a policy of not targeting neutral shipping, and but yet quite a few neutral ships were still sunk. It's important to understand this didn't necessarily play a role with Lusitania, but
Like the Tolton,
um,
right?
what's that?
The Tolton would
Yeah,
potentially
yeah,
be a
exactly, the
factor.
Tolton. So even though the Germans always had a policy in both wars of not targeting neutral shipping, there still ended up being quite a few neutral ships sunk simply due to mistaken identity. It's also worth mentioning is the Lusitania is kind of the best known of these large ships that were sunk with significant loss of life, but there were a number of other ones as well in both world wars. And one of them, the Laconia, which was a ship under sort of similar circumstances off Africa that was sunk and it ends up playing a large role in the narrative of Killing Shore. But there. My point is there was quite a few of these instances, whether it be the Lusitania or the Laconia or the Robin Moore, which is another one involving a U.S. ship in World War II before the U.S. entered the war. So the nature of going out on the high seas and throwing high explosives at ships that might or might not be the ones you think they are, or might not be armed. It basically lays the groundwork for these sorts of honest mistakes, sloppy cover ups, et cetera, et cetera. So the Lusitania was really just the best known of those victims, but by no means was she the only one.
Gotcha. And yeah, and just to kind of add in that like so that was in 1915. So the US doesn't enter the war until 1917. So the US had a we were very isolationist and did not want to be involved. But like you said, the Germans obviously didn't want to provoke us, but sentiment at home um, did not. I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, I think looking at Wilson and stuff like that, it's hard to say because at the end of the day, I think at the high level, there was an interest in making sure that Britain did not completely fall and all of Europe did not fall. But definitely from the people level, there was definitely an aversion to going into war. And then a big part also, I guess, to touch on is that the one of the things that, and I guess it a little relays is Mexico has not always been an angel. Is so one of the well, I guess the argument of the thing that really got us into the First World War would be I don't know if you want to touch on the fact that uh, the Germans and the Mexicans were kind of collaborating a little bit. So
Well, the Mexicans declined. So the the event that finally did bring the U.S. into World War One is actually the main event that did, because these incidents with either American ships being sunk or Americans being killed on other nation ships, that continued throughout the war, and it as I said, the Germans were paid a lot of attention to what sentiment in the U.S. was. They had a number of intelligence agents, spies over here, carefully gauging what the public sentiment was. So every time there'd be an incident where a few Americans died, Germans would dial it back for a few months, and then they would put the gas on again. And this continued, and it ended up contributing to the U.S. entry into the war. But really, the decisive event was an incident, the events surrounding what's known as the Zimmerman telegram. So in January of 1917, the German foreign minister, Arthur Zimmerman, he sent a coded telegram to the Mexican government.
yep,
And the Mexicans took them off guard. They hadn't proposed this or anything, but this telegram, it was a proposal from the Germans, and the proposal essentially said, "Hey, look, because we've got these U-boats that are sinking all these ships, and it might end up pushing the Americans into the war. Here's a proposal. How about if the U.S. does join the Allies, Germany and Mexico, we'll team up with you, and we'll provide political and financial support. And you, for your campaign, will you'll have the opportunity to retake some of these territory in the U.S. Southwest that had been Mexican for about 20 years back in the 19th century. So essentially, hey, Mexico, psst, if the Americans, the Yankees come at us, how about you and I team up?"
yeah,
And the Mexicans had no interest in this at all. I don't remember if they formally responded, but what happened was that telegram got sent in January from Germany. It was intercepted by the British,
yep,
and in I think it was late February, a copy of that message was handed to President Wilson, and he was stunned, as you'd imagine. And when this went public, I don't know, a day or two later, obviously, it's huge topic of discussion in the U.S. A lot of controversy. Some people saying we should get in the war immediately. Some people saying no, it's a British forgery to trick us. And what does Arthur Zimmerman over in Germany do? He publicly admits, yes, it's legit. So all doubts about its authenticity go out the window. And on April 6th of 1917, um, the president signed. Congress voted. It was a majority in both the House and the Senate. Uh, Voted for declaration of war. Majority in both houses, and then it was signed. Declaration of war was signed on, or it was signed off on by the president on April 6th. So it ultimately ended up being this Zimmerman telegram incident that pulls the U.S. into the war, and just absolutely stupid on the Germans' part. In fact, a friend of mine who was reading a proof of, or it was one of the early drafts of Chapter 2. He responded to me, and because I talk a little bit about the Zimmerman telegram in Chapter 2, and my friend said, "Why did he admit to it publicly?"
yeah. That's
And
the
the
first thing
response
I
I
did.
gave was because he was stupid, I guess. Like, it's such a harebrained, even to send the telegram was just, and as I said, the Mexicans really wanted nothing to do with any of this. So it ended up being entirely self-defeating on the Germans' part.
Yeah, no, it's definitely. I mean, again, that goes back to the whole. I mean, obviously, you can't Monday morning quarterback, but at the same time,
That
some
was
of the.
just stupid by any measure of
But that's
things.
what I mean. I mean, you had time to think about that. Now, like
Yeah,
the U-550, he didn't have as much time to think about it,
yeah.
but that one he definitely did. Um, so yeah, so that's definitely. So then also one of the things I wanted to like, I don't know that the average person really kind of appreciates or understands is because obviously being an American, we're protected by these two oceans, and it seems like we never really have anything come that close to um like everything is just far away for us, right? And one of the things that I don't know that a lot of people realize is how close. So, like, these German U-boats were on the coast, but we're not talking 50 miles out, 100 miles out. How close exactly, were they to the Jersey Shore?
Great question. So I'll say that on the typically they would be, call it 100 to 250 miles would be kind of the normal operational zone. They were often in closer. I mean, the RP Resor was hit 18 miles off Lavalette. So generally speaking, the ships would be out there, so 100 to 200 miles, sometimes closer. So we saw U-boats operate um, really across that entire spectrum. But you mentioned what was the closest that any of them got? Undeniably, the closest would be the U-202, which ran aground on Long Island on the beach at Amagansett in June of 1942. So the closest to the beach, the answer is on the beach,
So,
but
yeah, that's
they normally weren't operating that close. That was for a special operation. So I would say, generally speaking, they're operating 100 to 300 miles offshore because that's where they have the best likelihood. It's like fishing, right? You don't know what you're going to get. You go to an area and see if they're biting, so to speak. And one of the things you see oftentimes, because I read through countless logbooks that these U-boat commanders wrote during the patrol, and oftentimes they would go to an area, they'd see no ships for a day or two, and then they'd move along somewhere else because you're limited by both your fuel and your torpedoes. So
yeah.
whenever you run out of torpedoes or hit about halfway on your fuel, you got to start looking at going back. So they're trying to get the most return for their time spent here. So if there weren't a lot of ships in one area, then they'd move somewhere else. But the short answer to your question is they were all over the place, but the closest was on the beach, but normally we're talking a little bit farther out than that. So I would say the lion's share is out in that 200 ish offshore. But I mean, they can operate anywhere there's water. So
Well, the only thing that was making me think about it was, so one, you have, for instance, which I don't know if, I mean, for a lot of people who are familiar that are fishermen and for divers, the East Coast kind of, the continental shelf slowly kind of slopes out, right? So you kind of starts in maybe 40, 50 feet of water, and then it really kind of slopes out to a couple hundred feet of water. And then you get to the shelf, which we call, for us coastal people, we call the canyon. And if you're a fisherman, you know exactly where the canyon is, 60 miles or so out, and it's where it drops off big time, and you start getting tuna and marlin and just all sorts of, the big sea life.
mhm.
But as a German U-boat commander, one of the things that, I think, from my understanding, that they would think about a little bit is, they knew, like, for instance, that with the destroyers dropping depth charges, well, the depth charges could get you if you were in 100, 200, 300 feet of water like the U-550. But you couldn't necessarily, like, one of the things that they would do is, using that same topography, is they would be within range or whatever of the shelf line, and so that they could kind of go and then drop off the shelf and then drop into deeper water. And I think they kind of could go down to what, max around, what, 650 feet or something, that their pressure holds will.
Max. Well, there's the stated, like the factory spec, and then there's what they actually did. So I would say with any degree of safety, call it 900 feet in a
Okay.
real emergency.
And the
Um,
depth charges couldn't get down that far.
yeah, the depth charges were limited in depth. I do believe that put, yeah, 900 would put them that would put you below whatever the maximum depth for the ash cans would be. But you're completely right. They would use that deep water because it was better for hiding. One of the problems and part of the reason that they didn't usually operate in very shallow water is that there's nowhere to hide.
Yeah.
Especially the coastal topography, or I guess bathymetry would be the word. But the underwater terrain off New Jersey is completely flat.
Yeah.
So that entails a big hazard, and that kind of played a role in the U-352 situation, the wreck that we dived. The if you shallow water with no topography, it's really bad for a submarine, especially one that's actively being hunted. So the advantage you have if you are on the west of the continental or east of the continental shelf is that you can use that depth to hide, which you really can't do in shallower water. But beyond that, I thought this was important enough. I'm glad you mentioned it about the underwater terrain. If you look at the map that's on the inside of the book,
Mhm.
I included the 100 fathom line and then the Hudson Canyon that kind of connects the deep water to New York City
What we call the mud hole,
because
right?
yeah, because the if you look at the underwater terrain, the Hudson River actually keeps going on the seafloor, and that is what the Hudson River Valley and then the Hudson Canyon is. Which you got to buy the book and look at the map, folks listening at home. But that was a glacier, I don't know, 15,000 years ago, sliding down past what's now New York City. It cuts the Hudson River just by scraping the ground, and then it continued out into what's now the Atlantic Ocean. So that's where the Hudson Canyon comes from. It's basically a continuation of the Hudson River. It's just 3,000 feet underwater.
Yeah, and there's a lot of really great wrecks, like, I believe the Chopra's around there, and
Yes, near the
I know the
butthole.
oil wrecks, Chopra's at around I think around 210 feet, and the oil wrecks at around 170, and then, those are right in that mud hole, and then it shallows out for a little bit before hitting the shelf. But what is, like, I mean, I have heard or I've read in books that, like, when they had their periscopes up, they could actually see the boardwalk on the Jersey Shore, and, I mean, and for instance, like, the Tolton is 6 miles or I mean
Tolton is, I want to say 14, but it's close. It's another close one. So
yeah, exactly.
I will say that I don't think any U-boats ever actually saw the boardwalk per se. What they did absolutely see would be lights from the boardwalk. And it's important to understand that at one point, somebody was proofreading one of these chapters. When I was writing this book, I farmed the draft chapters out to people that had an interest. Like my dad was into it, a few other friends who would just I give their feedback on it. And one of the little pieces of feedback that I got on chapter 6 was somebody said, there's no way that they could have seen the lights from the shore. They're like 40, 50 miles off. The light will reflect off the clouds, especially where there's a low lying cloud layer. So coastal lights could be seen much farther out than you'd think,
Hmm,
especially on a dark night, because it'll reflect off the underside of the cloud. So you can see maybe not the boardwalk, but you can see a glow in the distance.
gotcha,
So did any U-boat commanders see the boardwalk itself? No. The guy that got stuck on the beach in Amagansett certainly saw the beach, but the lights were visible for quite a ways offshore. And at some points, especially the Palkenschlag boats, U-123 came in very close. They could see individual cars, like as a point of light moving along a coastal road. So they did get quite close. And like you said, Tolton, I want to say it's 14 miles. RP Resor is 18. The Lemuel Burrows, which was sunk the night after Tolton by the same U-boat. That's another one I want to dive. I don't know. I haven't heard much about the wreck, but that's another. It's shallower and that's even closer to shore than the Tolton. And the Lemuel Burrows, in fact, the U-404 was able to hit in part because it was so close to the shoreline. The coastal lights silhouetted the ship and gives you an excellent target. So yeah, there were ships that were sunk that close to shore. Absolutely, like I said, they could really run the whole gambit as long as you can put the whole boat underwater. Especially at night where they'd be a little safer, they were absolutely open to going in and going for a target if it was available.
Yeah, I just wanted people to kinda get an appreciation that, I mean, yes, the majority of them may have been a couple hundred, or 100 or so miles offshore, but, um, that it very much was, like, that close, and then also for context, like, the Tolton is in what, 90, 100 feet of water?
1995, yeah.
Yeah, and so, I mean, this is right off where, if you're a fisherman off Jersey and you're going out to the artificial reefs, and any of that stuff, like, this is right in that range. So it was quite close. Yeah, that was kind of one of the other things that I don't know that the average person really kind of appreciates. And then also the amount. I think, every time we talk to people, right, they don't really seem to ever when we tell them that there are thousands of wrecks off the coast, I mean, and some of them stretch back to the Revolutionary War and whatnot, but like there is a substantial number of wrecks from World War I and World War II off the Jersey coast and that we dive. And I don't think the average person realizes,
No, you're absolutely right. And I was going to mention this at some point, so I might as well do it now. So I've said I have versions of the story I've done on other podcasts and whatnot, but the true origin story of where and how I decided to do this book is it really came from Monday morning conversations at the office where this was right about the time that I met you on Gypsy Blood. But I'd be chatting with someone at work on a Monday, and they say, "Oh, what'd you do this weekend?" And so I went diving, did some wreck diving off of Jersey, and the person would go, "Oh, really? What kind of shipwreck?" I would say, "Oh, it was the Tolton or the Gulf Trade. It was a ship that was torpedoed by a U-boat in World War II." And inevitably, almost every time, invariably, I get the response of like, "What? U-boats off the Jersey Shore?" And I had this same conversation again with many different people over. "Oh, what do you like to do?" "I like diving." "Oh, what kind of wrecks are out there?" "Well, there's these World War II." What? So that was really what put the idea in my head that really kind of drove it home to me that there's the story here, obviously, but there's a story that people don't know about and that I think people would be interested in if I could tell it the right way. So that was the real genesis of this entire project, is having that conversation and having people go, "I had no idea there were ships getting sunk right here off the boardwalk." Well, yeah, there were quite a
Yeah.
few. So
Yeah.
another one I'll mention is that I think I told you a bit about the statistical work that I did during the course of this research. So I realized that when it comes to the Battle of the Atlantic in general and operations near U.S. shores in particular, there just were not a lot of reliable statistics that are out there in these historical a lot and for most purposes there are no statistics at all for the information that I was looking for. But those statistics that did exist, how many ships were sunk in this time period or off this coast, they were they did not strike me as reliable, and in a few instances they were basically just wartime estimates, very very rough estimates that they found in a um, old military archive document. So during the course of this research, I decided I wanted to, I want statistics to back up what I'm saying in this book, but I want them to be accurate. So I'll just calculate them myself. So it
Yeah.
took me a long time, but I was able to build a couple of spreadsheets that really captured all this data. And one of the data points that I wanted was how many ships were sunk off the US coast. And I came up with the answer. So for the entire war, for within 400 nautical miles, there were 216 ships that were sunk within 400 nautical miles of a U.S. coast, and that's Gulf and Atlantic. And there were another 47 ships that were damaged but not sunk. And of course, if you move that geographic limit out, that number gets much much bigger. But it's important to know. So 216 ships. That does not, and that's naval and merchant.
Mhm.
That does not include the ship sunk in the Caribbean, and it does not include the ship sunk off Canada. If you include those in, that number doubles, and the death toll doubles.
Wow. Yeah, that's pretty incredible that the amount of them that were sunk literally again, and we kind of just don't ever for a minute, I mean, think that like it was that
Yeah,
close to
it's
home.
forgotten history. Um, it's definitely forgotten, and people ask me why. Part of it is because there's so much going on in World War II that many parts of it are forgotten as far as public memory is concerned. Part of it is, I've always been a little bit frustrated that in the United States, our understanding of World War II is almost popular understanding is really almost limited to Normandy, June 1944. That's kind of where it starts and stops. It was the average, somebody that's not a history buff, their average American's understanding of World War II is there's Pearl Harbor, and then there was Normandy, D-Day, and then Hitler killed himself, and there a couple of atomic bombs are dropped. So that
Yeah, and
I
there's so
think
many and
it kind
we
of
might have
displaces so many other topics, and
yeah.
this being one of them. And so part of my goal, one of my goals in doing this project was to bring that sort of forgotten history to life for people that otherwise wouldn't have known. So at the risk of digressing too much, my goal here was to write something that anyone with an interest in the topic could understand and appreciate. So that's part of the reason why it's long. I wanted to explain the context and the technology so that any person, if you're a 12th grade reading level and you find this title fascinating, my goal was you should be able to read the book and understand it. That's part of why it was a little bit lengthy, but
Yeah, no, and perfect. And honestly, I mean, I've read the book, and for anyone, um, if you have the opportunity, I really recommend picking it up. It's a fascinating book. It's really well written, super easy to read.
thank you.
And given that, where is the easiest place? So if somebody is interested, where can they go and find your book?
So, great question. It's sold by most of the major book retailers. So it's on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, number of other places where you can buy books online. There's already used copies of it floating around. I guess people bought it and read it really quickly. It's also out in audiobook, and I was really, really satisfied with the final with how that came out because I didn't have it. They asked me if I wanted to narrate it. I declined because I wanted a professional to do it. The narrator they got's really good, so it's out in audiobook. It's also out in Kindle format, and there's a paperback version that'll be out this fall. It had to reach a certain number of sales units to be eligible for the paperback version. So, and apparently I don't know what the exact number was, but it did go beyond that threshold. So you can get it on Amazon, Barnes and Noble. It's not in most stores in hard copy, in my experience. I've stopped into a few Barnes and Nobles just to see. So if you're interested in reading it, I would say go to Amazon. You could pick your format of choice, and if you're intent on a paperback, that'll be out in I think October. But I'm a big Amazon guy. They don't
Yeah,
pay me
I
anything to
think for
plug that,
most
but
Yeah, I mean, I think for most people, I think Amazon's like the easy go-to.
yeah.
So I mean, that's probably the easiest place to go get that in either of those forms. And so, yeah, just definitely recommend it. It's a great book, and so definitely give that a look. And then just before, if you've made it this far in the video, please just click subscribe or the like button. It'll help with the algorithm. And then, so the other thing I wanted to get in, and I guess we could talk a bit about is kind of the diving end. And so we got a couple um there's some couple really good books that are completely relevant to what your book and everything else. And one of them is Where Divers Dare. And this is the story of the U-550 and the Penn, Pennsylvania. I don't know if you want to give a little
Mhm.
kind of gist on that. And then yeah.
Yeah, so this is Where Divers Dare. It's written by Randall Peffer. It came out in, I want to say, 2013, maybe 2014. And it tells the story of it tells two stories in parallel. One of them is the U-550 Penn, Pennsylvania incident, which is chapter 15 in my book. And it tells that story in parallel with the discovery of the U-550 wreck, which was made in 2012 by a well-known New Jersey diver and wreck discoverer named Joe Mizrani, who I know him. He helped me quite a bit in this project. Very great guy, but it covers both of those stories kind of in parallel. The 1944 story and then the 2012 discovery. Very good book. I used it as a source because my chapter 15, which is the climax of the entire book, it's the final chapter, the main story, covers the Pennsylvania and U-550. So I used his as a source, but I also found a lot of information that he didn't have, and I told my version of the story. Factually, it's almost the same thing. It's just told in kind of a different style. So I'd actually be interested. I don't think I've talked to anyone that's done this, but somebody that's really into this topic, I would like for them to read Where Divers Dare and then read chapter 15 from Killing Shore and just tell me like what they thought about it as far as comparing and contrasting it. But definitely a really good book, and it covers, like, as I said, both the history and the modern day stuff, and was quite important to my project as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, I've read both of them, and I could say that I thought both were quite gripping. I thought like I could not put yours down, but I also where divers dare. I also, I mean, that book alone, just with them figuring out how to sweep the floor to find it in the first place and whatnot, and then them just going down and diving it. I mean, just for everybody to know, this is I want to say what it's about 60 miles off the coast,
It's
and
at least, yeah, it might even be farther than that.
yeah, so it's 60, 70 miles off the coast, and it is in 330 feet of water, which, um, for people to understand in context, the average diver goes and gets their open water in 60 feet of water. If you get your advanced, you typically will go down to around 100 feet. Once you go past advanced and you start getting into closer to the tech world, and so like stuff we'll dive off the coast will typically maybe get us down to around 150. And then you start really getting into the tech guys where you need rebreathers and mixed gas and all sorts of different stuff like that. And then but when you go down and you dive at 330 feet, I mean, I know from with the Doria being at 250, if you spend 20 minutes at the bottom, you're looking at doing over an hour of deco on the line. And this is usually with maybe a bottle of oxygen at 20 feet for a substantial period of time. So you're not going down and just doing a recreational dive. Like this is very, very technical, and particularly the waters off of New Jersey and New York. We have days where, I mean, I've had an amazing day where I had 40-foot viz, but I would say the average day is somewhere between 5 to 15 feet of visibility. Water temperatures usually somewhere around, usually in the 60s up until about 30, 40 feet. And
Yeah, I
then
was gonna
below
say bottom temp would be like low 50s.
yeah, I mean, when you start going down, it's a bit of yellow pea soup, and then about 30, 40 feet down, it turns to pitch blackness, and the temperature drops to the point of your regulator will chatter. Kind of, it's you're looking at around 44 to 45 degrees temperature down there. So, yeah, it's cold, it's dark, and it's very deep, and you got to spend a lot of time
But
down
if
there.
you're really
So
committed, you do it anyway.
exactly. Well, that's why I think they say if you dive Jersey, there's not too many places in the world you can't
Yeah,
dive.
I put it's. I think you read that in a really good book recently.
I think so. I wonder what I think that might have been Killing Shark. So yeah, so I mean I think both books were just phenomenal. But yeah, the story is it's definitely recommend for anyone to read it. It's quite gripping. And then to add to another really good story that brings out a little bit even well, still it's actually about 60 miles off as well, is it's called Shadow Divers. And this is covers the U-869, right?
Yes.
It covers the U-869. And so I'll let you give I'll kind of give us a little background because this has a bit of an infamous history where one it was kind of a phantom one. Nobody even knew it existed. And then two, I guess you can go into a little bit of the story because I mean it is quite unbelievable how they were able to even identify the wreck. So, I mean, you want to?
Sure. So the U-689 is a, or U-869, excuse me. The is the subject of the book Shadow Divers, which was a nonfiction book by Robert Kurson, I believe was his name. Came out in 2004, and it's I still run into people all the time that have seen that book, and sometimes it's the first thing they ask me when this topic is like, "Oh, have you read Shadow Divers?" And sometimes I like to mess with them and go, "No, I haven't heard of it. What's that?" But Shadow Divers is like the gateway drug to this topic, and it definitely was for me. And it's the true story of a U-boat wreck that was discovered off central New Jersey in the 1991, and it was confusing because at the time there was no U-boat recorded as being sunk anywhere near that location. It just didn't make any sense. There was and so the book covers these New Jersey wreck divers that spend years trying to identify the boat. What boat number is this? And they dive it many times. There are, I think, three fatalities of divers that died during this effort to identify. They're going inside trying to find some sort of clue that will point them to the boat's identity. And for a while, they thought it might be U-550. That was one of the candidates. And I won't give away too much, but they end up finding an item inside that points them in the right direction. And it turns out that it was the U-869, which was believed to be sunk off Morocco. And it was not. It was off New Jersey. And the wreck sits at 230 feet. And that book is still, as I kind of mentioned earlier, it's still very well known, even among people that are not divers or not wreck nerds like us. But it's one of the best nonfiction books I've ever read. I have heard that maybe certain details aren't 100% true to life, but it is a nonfiction story, and to my understanding, that the gist of it is accurate and correct. And it's an excellent nonfiction read that covers science, history, interpersonal drama, and then it wraps it up with a satisfying conclusion to the mystery. And definitely recommend it if this subject area is, for those listening, this is of interest of you. Absolutely have to check out Shadow Divers. And the topic of that book, the U-689 and its mission, didn't really directly impact any of the stuff I covered in Killing Shore, even though it is a U-boat off New Jersey. This occurred in February of 1945, so this was well after the main events. So I do mention it in passing. I kind of spend 2 or 3 paragraphs talking about the gist of it and how it does interface with the topic, but still, despite it being a U-boat off New Jersey, doesn't get a lot of mention in Killing Shore. Partly because I think most of the important stuff has already been said. I didn't have anything new to contribute, but really a great read and a good introduction into the wreck diving world.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's again kind of to touch a little bit on the diving aspect of it. I think that's also one of the other things that makes that book so amazing is for people to have perspective. Is at the time, they were not really using rebreathers, which
They weren't even using anything other than air, than 21%.
exactly. And for do you want to give a little bit of context for everyone as to what would be so for instance, if you're diving on 21%, you typically have a bottom. I think Patty would recommend like a 218 is like your max. They were diving deeper than even your max, which means you actually kind of almost have to build up immunity uh, to, or a tolerance to that. But that they were literally pushing the limits on air, which would give them very little time. And do you want to kind of, I guess, kind of explain
Yeah.
why that's such a
So
big deal?
without going too far into the science, the guys that found the U-869 in 1991. So in that at that time, the only gas that was available to put in a scuba tank was just normal air, like we're breathing right now. 21% oxygen. That was the only show in town. In the years since, there have been a number of other different gas mixtures that are used for different kinds of diving. Like when when you and I dive, we usually dive what, nitrox 29, 30,
Uh, we typically, I mean, it depends. If we're doing a dive, I would say if we go down to North Carolina, we typically are doing 30%
30.
because it's
Yeah,
we've got
30.
an MOD of like 132. But if we're diving in New Jersey, I think we typically will use like 28 because some of the
28,
stuff
29. So
gives you a little
there's
more gas.
different gas mixes for different this for the listeners' benefit. Obviously, there's different gas mixes for different types of diving. Nowadays, to be doing a 230-foot dive, which is where U689 U869 sits, to be doing a 230-foot dive on air nowadays would be considered suicidally reckless. And back then, that was the norm. They were all doing it.
They were
Um,
always made differently back then.
yeah, unsurprisingly, there were also more than a few fatalities, including in this book. But it's just interesting to look back and see what we would consider reckless now. I mean, arguably it was still reckless then, but that was just it was the only show in town. If you were going to do deep wreck diving, there was just air. It's not. I remember later in shadow divers, later in the '90s, they start to finally use, I guess, trimix. But it's just crazy to think that anyone's doing dives that deep on normal air.
Yeah, I mean, and just not we don't wanna dive too deep into it, we'll save that for maybe another time, is just, the gas that they tend to oxygen, 21% oxygen or whatever, which makes up air, but, that at depth below 200 something feet becomes poisonous, and you could get oxygen toxicity poisoning, so what they typically will do is they'll use helium and they'll substitute that in so that one
Because it's
you
inert
don't have well yeah so you don't
biologically.
have the oxygen toxicity problem, but then you also don't have the narc problem, right, where most people on regular air would start to maybe feel narked around. It's different for everyone, but some people could be around 100 150 feet or something like that, but at 230 feet almost everybody would be narked, which is also what's unbelievable is they're diving on the edge of oxygen toxicity poisoning, and they're diving at a depth that almost everybody would be narked, which for people that's nitrogen narcosis. So that's just every 33 feet is like the equivalent of having a beer. So if you could only just imagine how many beers deep you are,
And
200 and
going into confined, doing a penetrating confined spaces. So yeah, no thanks.
yeah, no, it's it was in a completely different league, and for hopefully I plan on hopefully maybe see if he comes on at some point. But the two guys that were predominantly in this was John Chatterton and Richie Kohler, and there was a handful of other guys, but for the most part, these were the two main characters, and it's just unfathomable. I'm not the biggest guy, but I think John Chatterton's much bigger, and Richie's much bigger than me. So the fact that they fit in there is pretty impressive. And I will say this, that I mean, I had an ex-girlfriend who was not a diver by any means, had not even dove at all, and she picked up the book and she couldn't put it down. So it's definitely worth.
My dad had the same my dad, and then my buddy Eric, same thing. I said, "Oh, I think you might like this." He could not put it down. He gave it to his dad, and he couldn't put it down. So if you're a guy that likes reading, lots of ladies would like it too. But if you're a guy that likes you're not going to be able to put this one down.
Yeah, no.
And I also want to mention again for the listeners, but some of those guys that Andrew just mentioned, like John Chatterton and Richie Kohler, who were the two main characters, so to speak, of shadow divers. These guys and that generation of divers and the Jersey and New York guys, these are the OGs of the dive world. These guys are pioneers and kind of celebrities within that world. So I talk about we dive different gas mixes today because it's safer, and that's true. But part of the reason that these guys are so revered, rightfully so, is that they were pushing these limits putting themselves at risk, and doing some groundbreaking stuff in their day. So they're kind of, they're the titans of the wreck diving world, from a previous generation, but they're still active and diving and instructing today. In fact, if you go some of the dive charters, if you go look, they'll have dives booked out to U689 or U869, and it'll say like John Chatterton's, rebreather class, or whatever, deep wreck course. So they're still active, but these guys are the OGs of the wreck diving world.
Yeah, and I definitely, I'm hoping at some point, like I said, so these guys were pioneering in the rec space, literally pushing the limits. And then there was a handful of guys and girls that were trying to get to the bottom of some caves in the middle of Mexico, the deepest caves in the world. And you would not think when you're going to the bottom of a cave that you would need scuba gear, but down at the bottom of these caves, because a cave is not completely flat, it sometimes goes up, and you get these things called sumps. And so there was a group of cave divers, Jill Heinerth, Brian K. Cook, Bill Stone, a couple of these guys, and they were also pioneering rebreathers and stuff like that at the same time. So pretty incredible that this small group of people were really doing what they did now, and this was all done back in the 90s, and now it's rebreathers. We go out on a boat, and if you don't got a rebreather on or doubles, you look really out of place. So yeah, so it's pretty incredible. But yeah, so I just wanted to thank you very much for coming on. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, bud.
And I mean, I really think that for, if anybody, if they stuck around this long, I hope they really enjoyed it. I think that was, we could have gone on for probably another 2 hours. There's so much detail and stuff like that. And maybe we'll do that for some future podcasts. But yeah, this was a great experience. And I think, the people are going to get a lot of really good information out of it. So, I
Well, thanks for
appreciate it.
having me. I never turn down an opportunity to talk. So
Well, I mean, you're good at it. So, but yeah, man. So if for anybody, please go and check it out. It's Killing Shore: The True Story of Hitler's U-Boats Off the Jersey Coast. And this is K.A. Nelson. All right. Thank you.
thank you. Take care.